A teacher thought he could mock history and get away with it, until one student refused to stay silent. Westwood Academy had always been a place of prestige. Rows of brick buildings, manicured lawns, and hallways filled with students who mostly played by the rules. Teachers were respected, lessons followed a structure, and any disruptions were swiftly handled. But on this particular morning, something happened that no one saw coming. It was second period. The clock above the whiteboard ticked away as Mr. Leonard Grayson, a history teacher with over 20 years at the school, stood at the front of the class. He was strict, rarely smiled, and had little patience for students who questioned him. His lectures were usually dull, but today, his tone carried something different. "And that's the thing about these so-called activists," he said, setting his marker down with a sigh. His gaze swept across the room. They were dramatic, loud, always demanding something. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass always stirring the pot, never satisfied. A few students chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it felt like they were supposed to. Others sat frozen, eyes shifting between Mr. Grayson and each other, unsure how to react. At the back of the room, Jamal kept his eyes fixed on his desk. The weight of those words pressed down on him heavy, sharp. He had always prided himself on staying composed, carrying himself with dignity. But right now, his fingers tightened against the edge of his desk. Mr. Grayson wasn't finished. His voice grew theatrical, mocking. He started imitating Dr. King's cadence, twisting his words into something unrecognizable. Then, shifting his posture, he mimicked Malcolm X, turning his message into a parody. Laughter, hesitant at first, broke out in the front row. A few students smirked, some whispered to each other. But the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't amusement, it was discomfort, thick and suffocating. Jamal lifted his head, taking a slow breath, his heart pounding. This was wrong. Others knew it too. But no one was speaking up. He raised his hand. The room stilled. Mr. Grayson's eyes landed on him, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "With all due respect, sir, that's not accurate." A murmur passed through the room. A few heads turned. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Jamal sat up straighter. Dr. King wasn't just demanding something. He was leading a movement that changed this country. He wasn't stirring the pot, he was fighting for basic human rights. Silence. Mr. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't think you understand the point I was making." Jamal didn't waver. "I understand just fine." His voice was steady, measured. He could feel every eye on him, but he wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for himself, for the truth. Then the shift happened. A girl a few rows ahead pulled out her phone. She wasn't the only one. A few screens lit up. Mr. Grayson noticed. His expression darkened. "Put those away," he snapped, but the damage was done. By lunchtime, the video had spread beyond the classroom. It started with a few students sharing it in group chats. Then it hit Instagram, Snapchat. Within an hour, it was all over Twitter. "Yo, Jamal. You're all over the internet, man." Jamal barely had time to process it. He hadn't even seen the video yet. But there he was on screen, sitting straight-backed at his desk, voice firm, challenging Mr. Grayson's words. And there was Grayson, snapping back, rattled, losing control of the room. The comment section was on fire. "This teacher should be fired immediately. Good for that student. This is why people need to speak up. Grayson's been like this for years." Finally, someone called him out. But not everyone was on Jamal's side. Not surprised. This is what happens when you let kids challenge authority. The teacher was probably just making a point. People get offended over everything these days. Jamal exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his phone. This was bigger than he expected. And then, "Jamal, come with me." He looked up. It was the principal. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than it should have. When they arrived, Principal Callahan gestured for Jamal to sit. His expression was unreadable. You're aware of the video circulating? Yes, sir. Callahan sighed. This has turned into a mess. Parents are calling. The school board is involved. News stations have reached out. Jamal sat still. I want you to know you're not in trouble. Jamal's breath hitched. But this is bigger than just you now, Callahan continued. Mr. Grayson has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct an investigation. There's a meeting tonight, teachers, parents, the school board. If you have something to say, people will listen. Jamal hesitated. Speaking up in class was one thing. Facing a room full of parents, teachers, and reporters? That was different. I'll think about it, he said. That night, the school parking lot was packed. Reporters, teachers, parents all there. Inside, tensions were high. One parent stood. How is this the kind of man we trust with our children? Another, this isn't the first time he said something inappropriate. My son had him 2 years ago. He made jokes about slavery. We complained. Nothing changed. And then, let's be real. This is being blown out of proportion. One comment shouldn't ruin his career. Jamal's mother stood. My son sat in that classroom and watched a teacher mock the very people who paved the way for his education. You don't get to decide what's offensive when you're not the one being disrespected. Then, before he could think twice, Jamal stood too. I didn't plan on saying anything. But this isn't about getting a teacher fired. It's about respect. About what we let slide in classrooms, in schools, in this town. If I hadn't spoken up, would anyone have done anything? Or would we all just move on, pretending it didn't happen? The room fell silent. Then, the board president spoke. Mr. Grayson, this is not just about how your words were taken. It's about the fact that they were said at all. The verdict, Mr. Grayson was placed on indefinite leave. The next morning, Westwood Academy felt different. The usual hallway chatter was replaced with whispers. But the biggest change wasn't in the students, it was in the teachers. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave small nods. Because now they knew one student had spoken up. And for once, silence hadn't won. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more shocking tales, don't forget to subscribe to Shocking Fate and hit the bell icon to stay updated. Your support keeps these stories unfolding.